Now no one is going to want to say anything because the
I know,
recording is in progress. I'm like,
hello, hello, students of mine. I see you. I'm happy to see you. Greetings and welcome. So is it still cold out there today, okay, or is it warmed up at all? Oops, I think everybody's
It's
muted.
better than yesterday. It's 52 degrees right now, so
Balmy.
it's not too bad.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's it looks rainy. Like it's going to be another. Go ahead.
It's been rainy here the past
3
days. It's been raining a lot. So
yeah, we have. I think I've joked with you before that, like, as a Midwesterner, I talk about the weather. Like, that's what I do. Like, this is, and I'm sure you're very familiar with that living in Nebraska.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Like, it's materially important sometimes, but it's a beautiful day out there in Pittsburgh today. It's one of those sort of spring days where we got some rain last night, and it feels like all of the trees are just going to go over the weekend if we get some warm weather. So you can kind of see the end of cold weather in sight, hopefully, knock wood.
That's a good thing.
It is a good thing. Jack, can I introduce you quickly?
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay, this is my graduate student who I advise, Jack Kinsey. So I just wanted to say you may eventually see each other at an ASA at some point. But he's a first year in the history program at Pitt.
Oh wow.
Nice.
Now you have faces to put with names. Thanks for letting me call you out on that, Jack. You can turn your camera off now.
Oh, it's not a problem.
And then I think that I can see some names from students of mine from a course on the history of global health, and then another course that's on health controversies. So we're doing units on vaccination and on quarantine this semester, but it's a big sort of broad history of health course too. So folks who may not have as much experience thinking about childbirth and maternal health, but thinking about other things.
Okay, I think we are about ready to start. Is it okay to start, Drew? Okay, great. All right, so first I would like to say hello, everyone. I'm happy to see you all. My name is Macrina Lele. I'm the Associate Director of the African Studies Program at the University Center for International Studies at Pitt. And it is my pleasure to welcome everyone to this Critical Research on Africa series. So once every month, we do the Critical Research on Africa series, which is an opportunity to offer space for faculty and students to share their research projects on Africa and engage in critical discussions or discourse that improves understanding of the issues faced by the various countries in the continent, and also finding practical solutions to the issues. So the series is usually led by affiliated faculty to African Studies, and it aims to strengthen scholarly intellectual capacity, build community, collegiality, networks, and offer opportunities for learning about our interdisciplinary research and sharing feedback on our research. So today's forum was actually largely made possible by Dr. Mary Webber because of her professional connection with Dr. Williams, who will be our presenter. So I'll not take too much time, but I will briefly introduce Dr. Webber, who will in turn introduce our guest, Dr. Williams. So Dr. Webber is assistant professor in the Department of History. Her fields of interest are modern Africa, especially East Africa and the Great Lakes region, history of health and disease, environmental history, imperialism, and colonialism. She teaches courses on the history of Africa since 1800, the history of Africa before 1800, history of medicine and public health, environmental history, and history of global health. And her most recent publication is a book titled The Politics of Disease Control, Sleeping Sickness in Eastern Africa from 1890 to 1920, which is a history of African politics and colonial public health, focusing on sleeping sickness at the Lake Victoria and Lake Tanganyika. So Dr. Webber, I'm very happy to welcome you so that you can welcome our guest for today's event. And you will also be serving as the moderator for the session. Welcome, Dr. Webber.
Thank you so much, Macrina. It is always a pleasure to be with the African Studies program and once again, meeting with everyone in an intellectual space that is so fundamentally collaborative and interested in raising the profile on cutting edge research on African topics in the present day. And while you have given me several great compliments, I also want to make very, very clear that none of this would ever be possible without Macrina Lele and also the assistance of the staff at the African Studies program, including the invaluable Drew Medved. So it's wonderful to gather once again. We are thrilled to welcome Professor Oya Williams to discuss her research today with us in what is the African Studies program's flagship series of discussing current research on African topics. Professor Williams is an assistant professor in the Department of History and the Department of Medical Humanities at Creighton University in Omaha, Nebraska. She received her PhD from the University of Texas at Austin a bit ago, I think we'll say, but not a terribly long time. So she is an emerging and really exciting new scholar in the field. Her book project, a portion of which she'll discuss with us today, examines the intersections between biomedical maternities, traditional midwifery, and faith-based birthing institutions in Nigeria. She's the co-editor of Writing the Nigerian Biafran War. Her work has also appeared in the Journal of African Art History and Visual Culture and in edited volumes on the history of the First World War and childbirth and spirituality in the modern and contemporary world. Her teaching focus, as I am sympathetic to, is wide-ranging and covers a lot of territory, but her current repertoire includes courses on globalization and leadership in Africa, the origins of modern Africa, and global perspectives on medicine in Africa and the African diaspora. Again, as a quick logistical note, I will be moderating our questions as we go forward after Professor Williams' research presentation today. We will have the ability to keep an eye on both the chat, which Drew will help out with, as well as the general sort of Zoom world of raising hands and signifying that you have a query. We will have between 30 and 40 minutes to hear Professor Williams' presentation, and then hopefully 20 minutes or so for questions and discussion afterward. So as questions arise, please feel free to put them into the chat, but know that we will go and gather those up afterward to field queries to Professor Williams as I moderate. Thanks very much for everyone for being here with us today. And okay, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, Mary, for that wonderful introduction. So let me share my screen and then I'll get started. All right, so first of all, I want to thank the organizers of this lecture series for inviting me to share my work on this platform. And I'd like to thank everyone who took out time to be here today. And I look forward to interacting with you at the end of my presentation. So this research is a derivative of my larger book project, which Dr. Wobo just described, on birth politics in Nigeria and the contentious relationships between biomedical maternities, faith-based birthing homes, and traditional midwives. And today I'm going to talk specifically about Aladura Faith Homes, a set of maternity homes that emerged during the Aladura religious movement of the 1920s and operated on the principles of faith healing. And I'll look at how and why these faith homes transformed their identities from a religious institution operating in the informal realms of healing to a recognized religious entity that offered primary maternal care based on the principles of faith healing. And I want to say quickly that the word Aladura, which I'm going to use repeatedly here today, it means prayer people or praying people. So first of all, I'm going to give you an overview of the project and research questions, just to give you a sense of how and why I started asking the questions that I asked for this particular project. And then I'll discuss the Aladura movement and their ideas of faith healing. And after that, I'm going to talk about the founding of the faith homes and their transformation from an informal practice to a professional or institutionalized one. So when I was conducting research for my book manuscript, in 2016 or 2015, I came across a Facebook post by Christ Apostolic Church, the specific Aladura church that I'm going to focus on today. And hopefully you can read the picture, the words on the screen. But this post was essentially an announcement that the Faith Homes had become a member of the Voluntary Midwifery and Community Birth Attendant Association of Nigeria. And this was, for some reason, a call for celebration. So first of all, I wondered why it was such a fanfare that the church became a member of this group. And I also wondered exactly what this organization was, especially because the news was also celebrated in a national convention by the CAC in the same year. Then at the Faith Home itself, the Faith Home headquarters in 2016, I noticed along the hallways in close proximity to visitors, the certificate of incorporation for this Voluntary Midwifery Association, and also a certificate from the state government certifying that this organization was qualified and authorized to provide general maternity services and child welfare services to the people. Now, why this was curious to me was that in Nigeria during that time, and even now, it was common for churches, and it's still common for churches, including conservative churches like the Anglican Church, the Roman Catholic Church, to offer healing services, sometimes called faith clinics, for sick people and people experiencing different kinds of hardships. Now, but in the case of Christ Apostolic Church, they went outside of this informal realm of health seeking to establish a professionally recognized practice of faith healing. And so the question that I started asking was, how did this happen? Why did it happen? And what did their journey look like in the process of establishing legitimacy as a recognized healthcare provider? Now I'm going to talk about the Aladura movement itself to give you a sense of how this process began. Now, this movement started in 1929, but the foundations of it go back to 1918 and the outbreak of the influenza pandemic. Now, towards the end of the First World War, as soldiers returned to Lagos, African soldiers who fought in different different war fronts returned to Lagos, and from there moved on to other regions of Nigeria, in some cases other parts of West Africa. They came, with them came influenza disease. And in Lagos is especially important. Now, if you look at the map of Nigeria that I have on the screen, you can see Lagos located right there on the coast of the Atlantic. Lagos was one of the most important coastal cities in the British Empire. And it was also it also had a lot of traffic. And with this traffic came that influenza into the southwestern region and beyond that region as well. Now, in addition to this outbreak, there were at least 2 recorded outbreaks of bubonic plague in that region as well. And there were recurring cases of epidemics, epidemics of smallpox in the area. Now, to compound this whole scenario, there were also economic hardship that was a result of the global depression that came with the First World War. The prices of cocoa, the prices of palm oil, which were cash crops that the colony depended on, collapsed. And to compound the whole scenario, the British medical infrastructure, the biomedical infrastructure at the time, and the biomedical technology at the time period in the 20s were inadequate to deal with this whole situation. One of the responses that the British government took, one of the actions that they took to control the spread was to shut down churches. Now, people were desperate. They could not find solutions with the traditional doctors. They could not find solutions with the biomedical ones, and they could not find solutions in the European churches either. Now, if you look at the quote I have on the screen, this is a quote from a Church Missionary Society priest, and he explains that in an area as large as England and Wales in the southwestern region, there were no mission doctors and only 4 or 5 government doctors. And these government doctors tended to serve mostly government officials, members of the military, and members of the civil service. So the infrastructure was not there. And this whole atmosphere created an environment ripe for apocalyptic teachings and all kinds of faith healing groups. In fact, throughout the 1920s, a number of African independent churches would be instituted, and they begin to push against biomedicine and traditional medicine, and they begin to teach adherence, reliance on faith healing. But all of these activities did not result in a large-scale religious movement until 1929, when a man, Joseph Babalola, emerges as a prophet. And Joseph Babalola drew a lot of following, a lot of people. He triggered a large-scale religious movement because of the miracles that were attributed to him. In fact, when I was going through some of the European records, colonial officials and European missionaries too acknowledged Babalola's power as a prophet. And some of them will go as far as connecting and comparing his ministry and the kinds of crowd that he drew, the kinds of miracles that he performed, to the ministry of Jesus and the miracles that Jesus enacted on the road to Palestine. Now, the interesting thing about this movement was that, at least as of 1932, the attendants were mostly women. A lot of the converts were mostly women. If you look at the screen, I have a figure for 1932, about over 7,000 converts, total converts. And out of that 7,000, 6,000, a little over 6,000 were women. And now most of the issues that the women came with were mostly connected to reproductive health, fertility, pregnancy. And so from the very beginning, Babalola had to make some type of arrangement to deal with the situation, to address the needs of these women. And one of the things that he did was to create special services at the end of his revival programs to attend to these women. Now, because his teaching centered on a total adherence on faith healing, Babalola taught his followers that as a true believer, you could not rely on traditional doctors or traditional medicine, and you could not rely on the hospitals either. You had to rely completely on God for protection. So when it was time to give birth to these babies, the women came back to the churches, came back seeking for care and divine protection during childbirth. And so once again, Babalola had to make some type of arrangement to accommodate this situation. And one of the things that he did during this period was then to recruit older women, ministers' wives, and other female members of the church leadership to begin to assist women and provide spiritual protection and spiritual backing for them during their labor and delivery. So this laid the early foundations. This was the early stages of what became a faith home. Now, what these women used, some of the things that they used in their care were water, which was a critical element in Babalola's ministry. He would use water as a conduit for healing. He blessed water, prayed over water, and people used it as a conduit for healing. And one of my arguments is that this was a way for him to establish some type of cultural legitimacy. Now, another thing that they used was psalms, and I'll talk about that in a little bit and the connection with the traditional modes of childbirth. They used psalms and they used oil. Beyond that, it was mostly prayers, and he would organize special prayers and the recitation of specific psalms for these women. Now, despite Babalola's rejection of the traditional religion and medicine, his practice drew from culturally established norms of healing, and I argue that this was his mode of establishing cultural legitimacy among the people by drawing upon symbols of healing that they were already familiar with. And one of those symbols that was discussed just before was water. I'll give you an example. Traditionally, during childbirth, the traditional doctors or the priests would use sacred words called Ohun Ife, sacred words or blessed words, and water as conduits for healing. These words were believed to cause or bring about an expected outcome when uttered under certain circumstances. And sometimes they were also said into water. And then the pregnant women will then use this water, either drink it or infuse it in their baths, sometimes with herbs prescribed for whatever stage of pregnancy they were in. And during delivery as well, these words were also recited at various stages of labor to ensure divine protection and to prepare the woman spiritually for childbirth. So Babalola had a similar process, not just in his use of water, where he would pray over water, and then it's believed to assume spiritual properties. But he also had psalms, just like the sacred words in the traditional system. He had psalms. He prescribed certain psalms to be recited in different stages of the pregnancy. And I have on the screen too some snips of the psalms that he prescribed for various stages of various months in the pregnancy. And he had other psalms too to be used during labor. Now, the quote I have on the screen, this is a quote by a priest, a European missionary, based on a conversation that he had with Babalola in 1932, where he stated that Babalola simply allowed the people to bring the water and to hold the belief that after blessing it, it assumed healing power, so that he can get the people to actually come out and listen to him. Now, although Babalola's, a lot of his modes of healing revolved around the spiritual, I have to point out too that he went beyond the spiritual. The care that he provided, or what he taught and what he advocated, also emphasized the practical elements of prenatal care. For instance, he focused a lot on nutrition, on cleanliness, on exercise. Now, the book I have on the screen, Babalola Thoughts of an Apostle. This is a compilation of a lot of his works, at least the ones that we have access to and that were translated. And when you look at this, it's a 100-page book. 80%, or if not 90% of that book, of those teachings that were retrieved, are focused on cleanliness for pregnant women, care of pregnant women, conditions of labor, how to take care of a newborn, how to raise a child. So he paid attention to the specific elements of nutrition, the roles of nutrition, the roles of exercise, and these teachings would take root ultimately till date when the faith homes become established. So throughout the 1940s and the 1950s, not a lot changed with the ad hoc arrangements that Babalola put in place for the care of pregnant women, especially because the 1940s and 50s, especially the 40s, was a period of growth for the church. The mother church of CAC was Faith Tabernacle, but in 1942, that congregation splits into two. One becomes Christ Apostolic Church, which is the one that Babalola was affiliated with. Now, Christ Apostolic Church was the part of the congregation that advocated total reliance on faith healing. The other congregation, the Apostolic Church, advocated flexibility in seeking care. So through the 1940s, the church was just trying to build its structures. But by the 1950s, a lot of changes began to happen that led to the establishment of faith homes. And one of those changes was the expansion in Nigeria of the nursing and midwifery fields. And these fields, these new fields, expanding fields, became an avenue for employment for Nigerian women. Because prior to this time, Nigerian women were excluded, largely excluded from the colonial economy. Now, when the field of nursing and midwifery began to expand due to demands and more midwifery schools were being opened, more training centers were being opened, Babalola, on the one hand, a lot of his church members, a lot of CAC church members belonged to, got trained as nurse midwives along the lines of biomedicine. So on the one hand, Babalola wanted to create a parallel institution that could enable members of the church who felt called to midwifery to train as midwives along the lines of faith healing. But on the other hand, these women too were pushing, mounting pressure on the church to organize their care of pregnant women in a more efficient way. And a lot of these trained nurse midwives were also leaders, recognized members in the Aladura church. So, and then when you look at the other, on the part of the colonial government and European mission churches, they had been pushing back against Aladura churches and against CAC in particular, because that was the church that Babalola was affiliated with. And part of their long-running criticism of CAC and other churches, other Aladura churches, was that they did not have any elaborate structures and so should not be taken seriously. And then they were also constantly accused of disturbing the peace, for holding revival services, and obstructing medical officials' ability to perform their duties by teaching faith healing. And they were also accused of undermining public health. So what Babalola did was to seek ways to streamline the care that CAC provided for pregnant women in order to deal with all of these criticism and also deal with the pressure that was coming from the inside. Now, in 1958, he created a faith home. In 1959, he moved, created a faith home as a distinct institution, distinct part of the CAC constitution or congregation. Now, it was no longer the practice that pregnant women just showed up in the church and they could be attended by any woman in the church. This time, the faith home becomes a distinct part of a CAC, affiliated to any medium to affiliated to any medium to large sized CAC congregation. In 1959, he relocates this to a permanent location. And then when he relocates this, he commissions it sometime in July in 59. The night of the commissioning, the night that he does the commissioning, Babalola passes away. So this was basically his last act in his ministry. But before he passed, he had approached a trained nurse midwife who trained in London and also in Nigeria, and was also recognized as an evangelist to become the matron of the faith home, to be in charge of the faith home. And the reason that he did that was to push back against criticism that they were jeopardizing public health and they were not qualified to provide any sort of care. Now, I can talk about the nature of the training that the midwives received in the training center, because now once the training center gets established and takes off under the leadership of a matron in 59, women from every church, really mostly Aladura and other Pentecostal churches, who felt called to midwifery enrolled in the training center for training. And the training was initially patterned after that of grade 2 midwives in Nigeria, the biomedical equivalent of this. And the grade 2 midwives is essentially auxiliary midwives that did not require any sophisticated level of education to get their training, and their training was also typically shorter. Now, after the Nigeria gains independence in 1960, so the kind of pressure and the kind of criticism and the kind of sabotages that this Aladura church experienced from the colonial government and from European missions was no longer present to a large extent in the post-colonial period. But at the same time, they began to face mounting criticism by their biomedical counterparts. And part of the criticism was that the faith homes exceeded their limit by refusing or failing to refer critical cases to the hospital in a timely fashion. So what the faith home does to address this situation was create a referral system, align itself with the recognized biomedical system, create a referral system to further consolidate biomedical and government endorsement. And in this referral system, they partnered with a hospital and a doctor, so that if there was an emergency case or a case that they could not deal with, then this patient would be transported to the hospital that they have partnership with, or the doctor can be called in at any point to assist in childbirth. They also created the position of a doctor in charge. Now, this was usually drawn from one of their members, because their members also worked in the health professions. Even in the 1950s, 60s, their members worked in the health professions. So they typically selected somebody, a recognized doctor, a prominent doctor from their midst, and appointed this person as a doctor in charge. And the reason they made this move was because although they had an increasingly cordial relationship with the post-colonial government and the government physicians as well, there were still those who remained hostile to the institution, arguing that they were assuming the hospital's role in maternity care. So to protect themselves from these types of arguments, what they did was to create not only the referral system, but now the position of doctor in charge, so that they can make the argument that they follow all of the necessary protocols required in women's primary health care. And they did make this argument in 1993. One of the matrons recounted how she was invited to a meeting with government doctors, because at this point in 93, the reputation of the faith home, the training center, which was also an active faith home, was already well established. And a lot of women, including Muslim women in that community, would prefer to go to the faith home for their care rather than go to the hospitals. So the doctors wanted to find out what arrangements they can work out with the faith home, so that the faith home would send patients their way, because a lot of people were just not going to the hospital. But the matron argued, hey, we do the same thing that you do. We provide the same services that you do. So there's really no need no need to send patients your way. They came through a different arrangement, but this was the argument that the matron made. Now, in the late 80s and 90s, something else was happening. There was a new reinterpretation of faith healing. And the church would begin, under the guidance of these biomedically trained nurses, midwives, and then doctors, their members who were health workers, the church began to revisit its approach, its attitude to medical sciences. And so by that period, you begin to see they begin to adopt things like blood pressure machines, which became a constant feature of the prenatal care that they provided, the weekly prenatal care that they provided to women. They also started doing, they had glucose test strip, HIV test strips as well. These became standard in the faith home. But now this new reinterpretation of their relationship, their attitude to medical science was also being pushed by the younger generation. And CAC, one of the major reasons why it survived all of these years, why the faith homes survived all of these years, was that they had patronage from the people. They provided a service that was practical, but also spiritual in nature, addressed the spiritual concerns of people when it came to childbirth. Now, in the 80s and 90s, the younger generation, there was a new generation of Aladura members. The 1920s generation did not see biomedicine as useful. It was inefficient to address most things. The 1990s generation could clearly see the benefits and the advantages of biomedicine, and they could not understand that requirement of adhering absolutely and completely to faith healing. So there was a shift. Now, when you look at the constitutions for CAC, when you look at all of the CAC constitutions till date, and you look at the ecumenical publications that they put out, a lot hadn't changed. They did not change the language of faith healing. The church still believed in absolute reliance on faith healing. But in practice, in the 90s, it no longer became like an aberration for a member to go to the hospital. They assumed the policy that a member can decide to go to hospital if necessary, and mostly because of economic reasons too. CAC membership always cut across a lot of different social class and social strata. So amongst their membership, they had government workers, people who worked in the civil service. They had lecturers, people who worked in the academic sector. They had people who worked in larger corporations. And to get sick leave or to claim maternity leave, these individuals had to provide paperwork from a government hospital. So they had no choice, whether they liked it or not, than to go to those hospitals, register, show up at certain times, and get the paperwork that they needed. So these were some of the things that was fueling the changes in the faith home, in the structure of the faith home. Now, over the years, the faith homes sought regulative legitimacy as well through registration and affiliation with health and professional agencies. At first, not necessarily because they wanted to, but because they had to. Because the moment they transitioned themselves from the informal realm of health seeking to an institution that provided training, actually trained midwives, posted midwives to locations, had refresher courses. They subjected themselves deliberately or indeliberately to the rules that governed private hospitals and private practices. And so they had to abide by these rules and affiliate themselves with these organizations or be labeled illegal or held culpable if something went wrong in their facilities. Now, the faith home itself, the Faith Home Training Center, was covered because it was registered with the federal government, it was registered with the state government. But the problem then became the subsidiary faith homes, all of the other faith homes scattered in CAC or attached to CAC congregations across the country. Depending on the state, some states, especially Lagos, this was problematic in Lagos. Lagos State wanted the faith homes, and it had over 150 of these, wanted each faith home to register as an independent entity, an individual entity. The church, on the other hand, wanted them to register as a block to narrow down, streamline their conversation and the conversations between them and the government. So going back to the initial Facebook post that I referred to at the beginning, one of the solutions that they came up with was to actually create the organization Voluntary Midwifery and Community Birth Attendant Association. Get that approved as a legitimate institution, recognized institution, or recognized body, and then have those faith homes, the other faith homes, register under this organization, become a part of the organization, but also other qualified community birth attendant associations could register. And then they would use the certificate of incorporation for this organization as proof that they were legitimate, as proof that they were not illegal maternities. So this was one of the solutions that they came up with in their bid to legitimize themselves. And so if you remember that Facebook post, at the end, the statement concluded, they are delighted that the era in which the CAC faith homes were regarded as illegal was over. Now, I'll conclude quickly by highlighting briefly why this work is important, both to me and to the scholarship on maternal health in Africa. One of the things that I try to do by exploring this subject is to diversify our understanding of reproductive health actors, especially during the colonial period. So when you look at the literature on reproduction and reproductive politics in the colonial period, it centers around the colonial government and missionary maternities. So what I do is to shift the narrative from colonial actors, that's the mission and the state, as initiators of change, and to show how an indigenous African church, a local actor, actually inserted itself within the narrative of maternal health and reproductive control. And reproductive control was especially important at various moments in Nigeria's colonial history to the European missions on the one hand, and to the British government at a different moment. So it is important to actually insert to see how an indigenous actor attaches itself to all of these politics going on, revolving, or decision-making revolving around women's reproduction. Now, conversations about authenticity also continue to remain at the center of discussions about post-colonial African institutions. And one of the recurring questions revolve around the standards for determining the credibility or legitimacy of an institution. Would these standards be based on Western principles or local concepts and norms? What would it be based on? What would determine that an African institution is legitimate? Is it by its attachment to a Western framework? So what I do here is demonstrate how CAC and its faith homes navigated this issue by quoting legitimacy from state and state-backed institutions, as well as by tapping into local sociocultural institutions and local sociocultural norms as well. Now, I can talk about the importance of these maternity services that they provide during the Q&A, but just to give you a sense of scale, from April 2018 to May 2019 alone, the CAC faith homes recorded 65,792 births. And this is just to underline their popularity and the extent of their services to the communities that they serve. On that note, I'd like to end and hopefully extend the conversation during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, that was really, really interesting. What I think might make sense if you want to, yeah, we'll sort of do our virtual and stilted round of applause. Why don't you, unshare your screen, and that way we can see everybody again. Fantastic. So I have a bunch of questions that I've written down over the course of listening, but I would like to to encourage the students present to actually bring up a question first. So those of you who are Pitt undergraduate and graduate students know who you are and where you are. So we really want you to ask our first question and get us started off. Anything that you're curious about Professor Williams' research, or how she has worked on it, and where she is headed. And then we will welcome questions from faculty and other members in the audience.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and ask a question if that's all right.
Thanks. Go ahead.
Yeah. Dr. Williams, could you explain just how you became interested in this topic and kind of the background of how you came about to put this research project together?
Okay. That's an easy question, but also a hard question, because there's a whole story behind it. So back when I was, after my undergraduate program, I went to northern Nigeria, and I worked with the National Reproductive Health and HIV and AIDS scheme. So during that process, I did a lot of work with young women who were also pregnant, and I came in touch with a number of reproductive health issues. And it was at that moment that I also realized that the maternal mortality rate for Nigeria was very high. At that time, Nigeria was ranking number 2. It's still ranking, it's always ranked between 2010 and till date, it's always ranked in the top 5. Right now, it contributes to 20% of the maternal mortality rates. So that's how I got interested in this line of research in the first place. And this kind of shaped my graduate program itself. So now I started looking at birth politics. I started trying to figure out the whole background to that number. Why this rate? You know, what is going on? What is the history of childbirth in this location that makes it so that Nigeria is contributing 20% of this rate? So that's what got me into the larger project in particular. And then during this process, I learned about the Aladura faith homes. And this is not something I saw in any literature, because a lot of the literature on childbirth just focuses on the biomedical facilities, so the hospitals, and then the traditional midwives or the traditional birth attendants, but nothing about the faith homes. And I first learned about the faith homes when talking to someone from the southwestern part of the country, where it's very widespread and very common. And then I started my research. And as I just continued, I found it more fascinating. And so I decided to actually do an article on the subject, as well as include them in my conversation about birth politics in Nigeria. So I hope that answers part of your question. I think there was a second element to your question. If you could remind me, I feel like I'm missing something.
No, you answered that just fine. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
And so again, the floor is open for questions. You can put them into the chat or read them out loud. I see we have another question from one of the students. Joe, do you want to ask that audibly yourself, or would you like me to read it?
Yeah, I can ask it.
Thank you.
I was just curious, do these faith homes play a larger role in rural health areas when comparing them with urban health areas due to access of healthcare?
Okay, that's actually an excellent question. Yes, they do. Not just in the rural areas, but also in the urban areas as well. For instance, Lagos State is urban in many ways, but that's one of the places that they have some of the largest numbers when it comes to faith homes. Now, when I was doing this research, I went to 3 major cities, well, 2, Lagos and Ibadan. And I also went to Ede where the Faith Home, the midwifery school, was actually located. And in the course of my research in Ibadan is in Oyo State, part of what I discovered was a shortage of doctors. For instance, they have like 800 primary healthcare centers in this state. And for that 800, there were only 23 doctors that covered it. And so you find that a lot of these centers were just inactive. A lot of them were closed because there was no doctors to manage. So accessing care for a lot of women, sometimes in the urban areas as well, the ratio for the doctor to patient ratio is very low. But when you look at the Faith Homes itself, every CAC congregation, unless it's a small congregation, had a Faith Home attached to it, had a midwife, and had 2 assistants, usually people in training, attached to it as well. And they had constant touch. They were in constant connection with these women. For instance, they do weekly, in some cases, bi-weekly prenatal checkups from the beginning of the pregnancy till the end. And it was a requirement that if you wanted to birth in the Faith Home, you had to register no later than 5 months of the pregnancy, so that they can monitor you, deal with whatever potential problems that you have, deal with it in a practical way, but also deal with it in a spiritual manner, because the spiritual element remained very important and critical. They believed in things like evil eye, things like abiku, like born to die children who were believed to be born and then they die and they are born again in the same family, and the cycle keeps repeating until it's broken. So this puts them in touch with women who would otherwise not be in touch with any kind of care provider at all throughout their pregnancy. So they do play a central role in that regards, although that role is not talked about a lot, even in the academic literature. But I think the gap in the academic literature is mostly because of the kinds of sources that we work with. For instance, historians tend to work with, where you don't see Faith Homes in the archives. In the archives, the colonial officials focus more on the political dimensions of the Aladura movement, the potential of this thing turning into a political movement. Now, the missionaries, on the other hand, could have recorded the activities of the Faith Homes, but by the time the Faith Home becomes organized enough to warrant missionary attention, it was independence. So you don't see a lot of that in the archive. You don't see anything really in the archives, but they do play a central role to healthcare provision, to maternal healthcare provision, because if the right kind of partnership is fostered, they are in the position, they have the manpower to flag issues, to flag cases that would ultimately result in maternal deaths or some type of complications. I hope that answers your question, Joseph, but thank you. That's a very good question.
Thank you.
Oh, and I forgot to mention cost too. Cost is very important as well, because that was part of why the reason some people gave as to why they went to the Faith Homes versus the hospitals, because they felt they were treated more respectfully, and they also felt that the cost was a huge difference. The cost was minimal. Sometimes the Faith Homes charged just a mere registration fee and a token fee, and that's it.
So we have 2 questions that have come up, or one person who signaled that they have a question, and then others that were sent in the chat. If Oyoronke Oyowumi could go ahead, please go ahead and ask your question, and then Andrea Arrington-Sirwa, go ahead next. We'll keep tabs.
She may be muted.
I don't know.
Unmute.
There
Yeah.
you are. Hello. Thank you. Go
Okay.
ahead.
I was just saying, I'm sorry, my camera is out of commission, but
Not a problem at all. We don't require cameras on.
I'm glad to be here. And Oge, thanks so much for that wonderful presentation. Very informative. I have 2 questions, or maybe 1 question and a comment. The first one has to do with infant mortality and maternal mortality. Were you able to see that in places where they had these faith-based maternal institutions? Did you see any decline over time in terms of mortality, or that horrendous statistic of high maternal mortality and infant mortality in Nigeria? Has it been constant over a long period of time? So one of my curiosities is where they have these faith-based institutions, do you see the numbers going down? That's my first question. Then my second question is this. I'm a gender scholar, as you might know, and I was getting nervous about the language, especially when you started talking about manpower. And then when we start talking about reproduction, women's reproductive life, I think that we need to sort of give more credit to women. I am wondering how Babalola stands out as the founder of these institutions, because I'm also remembering that during this period, many of the churches, many of the independent churches, Aladura churches, were started by women. It was not only the congregation that was overly female. What was also interesting about these churches was that many of them were founded by women. And I didn't hear much about that in your presentation, especially since this also has to do with women's reproduction. It's women who did the work, right. Every part of it. And so we need to give them credit and be able to locate Babalola where he belongs. I'm not saying he didn't do anything, but I keep thinking of, are we erasing women's history here and women's contribution? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, would you like to collect the questions and speak to them, or would you like to have them in series? What would you prefer?
Series is fine.
Okay, go right ahead.
So I remember.
Could I make a request?
Go
I
ahead.
have another Zoom thing starting in a few minutes.
Okay.
So I'll have to leave, but I'd like to hear you respond.
Yes, go right ahead. Thank you for letting us know. That's
I'll
perfect.
respond real quick. Yes, I totally agree with your comment about women, the role of women in the Aladura churches. And in fact, Faith Tabernacle, what became Faith Tabernacle, one of the co-founders was a woman.
Mm-hmm.
And then ultimately—
you name them too, okay? You should give us names, because you didn't give us the name of the midwife woman. We need their names. They need to be acknowledged and recognized, okay?
Yes, I'll take note, and I have there. I don't know if I mentioned Sophia Odunlami, but I do talk about it in my because this is a work in progress. An article that I'm actually working on. This particular presentation is based on an article, but I actually talk about the matrons, the three matrons, the one that became the pioneer matron in 1959. And then the other three, she's late now, the other three that became matron after her, I actually interviewed them and I discussed them a lot, especially post-1959. But the comment about the role that women played, I don't know if I mentioned it, but Babalola had partnered with, in CAC in particular, Babalola seemed to be the person at the center of this push for faith homes. What the people that I interviewed, including women and including the matrons, said was that it was a divine calling. He said this was a calling that God gave him to address this particular situation. So he was in many ways front and center, even with the teachings on maternal health as well. But on the other hand, in the 50s, a lot of the push to organize in some way, although they say that, okay, well, he got a revelation, to establish a faith home. But the way I analyze it is that that move to establish a faith home was actually pressure from the women themselves, these women who were trained nurses and midwives on the one hand, but to actually execute the erection of a faith home, the building of a faith home and the management of that faith home, he partnered with the CAC Good Women Association. In 1944, the Women's Wing, a women's association, gets founded, and they became very organized. And a lot of these women would play a role. This organization itself would play a role in the establishment, construction of the faith home. Until date, they are still central to the management of this faith home. And in honor of the work that they did, one of the original buildings in the faith home in Ede was actually named after them. So, but I'll take note of that comment by Prof and make sure that I emphasize the role of these women as well. And then regarding the comment about, Prof, I know you have to go. So regarding the comment about the numbers, whether the numbers have gone down, this is something that I haven't looked at in greater details. I've been looking at the records that the faith homes have, but the records are also tricky. This is the impression that I get from some doctors, that although the faith homes do not record a lot of deaths, so when you go through their records, they do not have records for a lot of mortality in their facilities. But then when you talk to some doctors, what some doctors say is that, well, in some cases, they wait until it's almost too late to refer a case. And so when the person gets to the hospital, the fatality happens in the hospital and it goes on the hospital record. So there is that. But when you look at their data, I haven't looked at whether the rates decline in general in the areas where they are functional. But when you look at their own books, you actually see pretty good statistic, especially with the CAC faith homes in particular, because when we talk about faith-based birthing facilities, there are also those who practice without any kind of supervision, any kinds of structure in some little churches here and there. I'm not talking about those in this particular conversation, because there's all kinds of controversies, if you will, connected to them, especially the fact that they take on too much, that they do not flag, they believe that faith is going to cure everything, and they do not flag issues that should be flagged and sent to the hospital. But the faith home in particular, CAC faith home.
Thank you. I have to leave.
All right. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
So, okay, we have a couple of really good questions, and I actually think in this case, a few of them are in the chat, but I'm going to have, I have Professor Arrington Sirois, and I apologize if I'm not pronouncing the second half of your name correctly.
No, you did it really, really well. Good job.
Well, as a Weibull, I always try, right, because nobody gets it right. And then we had a question from Macrina, a question from someone whose name I do not know, but who on screen is Technopouvoir 3, and then a question from one of our students, Alexis Chiara. So what I would suggest doing, because I think this might at least let you hear all of the questions, is let folks answer them in three, or let folks ask them together in a row. And then, because a few of them are also in the chat in text, then you can select which ones you want to answer before, say, 1:10, because I don't want to keep you much later. But I'm so excited about these fantastic questions in this conversation. So please go ahead. Professor Arrington Sirois, and then Macrina, and then Technopouvoir 3, whoever you are, and then Alexa. So, and then Oge can choose which to answer in the time allotted.
Great. Thank you so much. This was so interesting, Dr. Williams. And I don't have my camera on because I'm in the cornfields of Indiana, and it like messes with my limited bandwidth. I think you might understand from Nebraska. So, and I'm definitely going to be in touch with you because there's so much about your research that's really interesting. Very quickly, my two questions. how did the Aladura handle pregnancies that become identified as high risk or labor or deliveries that require emergency measures? It seems like you were just actually getting to that point in your answer to the previous set of questions. So I'm particularly interested in cases where either the mother or the neonate's life is potentially in danger. And I'm also very interested if there's signs of premature birth or what happens in the case of a premature birth. And then I do research on this in Zambia. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is these fluctuating policies on how to involve traditional birth attendants in prenatal and postnatal care, and the tensions and sometimes synergies that exist between the midwives, who are of course licensed, certified, much more kind of geared towards the biomedical world now, versus the traditional birth attendants, because there's these fluctuating policies that sometimes really push the TBAs out of the whole equation, which is a huge problem for accessibility.
Right.
And so I was wondering how you, or if you've run into seeing a tension between TBAs and midwives, and where the Aladura kind of fit into that dynamic. Thank you so much. Such interesting research.
Thank you. Thank you. And I look forward to connecting with you, really. Thank you for those questions too. So I'll answer the first one.
Well, actually, okay, hold on. Wait, let's grab them all, and then you, because I think there's one that actually overlaps with this one, so it'll be useful. So then Macrina, go ahead, and then Sikuru and Alexa.
Thank you, Olga, so much. I mean, this is really intriguing. I was just curious as you are giving your presentation, whether at some point you'd comment on some of the criticisms that have come up about this whole, faith homes. I read a lot, and I've seen a lot of issues, and also from where I come from, we have similar practices and things, but there've always been people who take advantage of these kind of systems and, cause problems and make the media, go crazy about it and really make everything look like it's all bad. So I was just curious about your take on that. Thank you.
Okay.
And then Sikuru, go ahead. And if you could introduce yourself, sorry, I want to make sure everybody's got the info.
Okay,
Thank you.
Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Yusuf Sikuru Abiona from Nigeria. So I actually want to ask the doctor, regardless of the location of the faith of people in terms of their economic viability, are they low income earners or otherwise? So it's very important in terms of location of the faith home base. Are they people that are low income earners or people otherwise? Thank you.
Will it be helpful if he actually types the question in the chat? Because you kept breaking up, so we couldn't really hear you.
Yeah, I grabbed and Mrs. Sikuru, I grabbed the question that you initially submitted and sent it directly to Oge just now, but if you want to go ahead and type it, that's fine. And I'll let Alexa ask the question while you're doing that, so that we can make sure we catch it.
Okay.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks. Alexa, go ahead.
Hi, I was just wondering, how were faith healing practices able to keep their legitimacy if the population still got ill? Like if a mother used all of the blessed water and recited all of the religious phrases at the correct time, but their baby was still born ill?
Thanks very much. So while we're, let's wait a minute for, there we go. So the question from Mr. Sikuru is, regardless of the location of the faith home, how would you describe the categories of the people seeking healthcare at the center? And I caught mention of their economic status, or thinking about the economics of the population seeking care there. And okay, just as a side note, I'm grabbing these out of the chat and putting them in an email to you as well. for later.
Thank you.
You're
Yeah,
welcome.
that's
I know
helpful.
exactly. I have been in your shoes. So please go ahead and share your thoughts. I may have to jump off at 1:15, but we'll keep going without me, and Macrina and Drew will close us out as needed. Okay. Go for it. Whatever you want to answer, go ahead.
Okay. All right, let's see what we have here. Critical cases. Okay. So one thing, and Macrina, this also kind of connects to the question you asked about criticism. So this particular faith home, system of faith homes by CAC is different in many ways from the other similar institutions that say some Aladura churches or some smaller Pentecostal churches have in place. Because not only did they institute training, 2 years training. So the training kind of mimics the training that a midwife would get in a midwifery school. The training lasted for 2 weeks and included basic anatomy, basic health education, as well as homiletics, how to, the act of sermon, the act of preaching, and the act of writing a sermon as well. And then when they incorporated that referral system, and this is something, the system that they have is something that's different from a lot of other faith-based practices. They created an annual refresher course as well. So every year in April, all of the midwives will assemble back at the faith homes from different parts of the country, in some cases outside of the country, because CAC in many ways is a global church, but they would gather and have refresher courses. And in these refresher courses, they had doctors giving lectures, answering questions. They have pastors, they have midwives, they have representatives from the Ministry of Health. So they are taught like current practices and things that they need to do, or things that they need to recognize to flag a potential critical case. And so, for instance, they had adopted this practice, like as this practice regarding multiples, like a birth of twins. If a woman was pregnant with twins, the rule was that this woman had to register with a hospital, or register with their referral hospital, the hospital that they partnered with, but she had to register with a hospital just in case things go wrong sometime in the pregnancy, or in case there is the issue of premature labor, so that they can easily, this person can easily access care in the biomedical setting as well. So they had different, and then they began to monitor, like they began to monitor blood pressure every week. They began to do glucose tests. So they have a sophisticated system where they seem to, they were paying attention to reducing the incidence of complication. And if something existed, if there was something there, then they would refer it to the hospital. And then before now, it used to be that when a woman had a narrow pelvis, so they actually took medical history. If you've had cesarean section before, then they want to see the record. They want to know why. If it's a narrow pelvis, one of the matrons said, well, God cannot, there's nothing you can do about a narrow pelvis. And one of the women, the midwives that I interviewed in Lagos 2 years ago also said the same thing. She was a supervisor in Lagos. She said the same thing. So their policy with that is that you will have to register with the hospital, but then you could come back, you could keep coming to the faith home for prayers and for your prenatal care. But when it's time to give birth, you have to go to the hospital. And what they would do is offer those prayers all through those months to make sure that things go smoothly for you. So they had things already set in place. And because of their connection to doctors, and again, they had doctors who they partnered with as well. And this usually was, like I said in the presentation, a doctor who was also a CAC member. They had members who were health workers. So these members served in an advisory capacity and had a faith home board, a governing board that actually made decisions on how the faith homes would be run. And again, to your point, Macarena, of course, there's still some criticism, especially in certain locations, not necessarily in Ede, the Faith Home Training Center itself, or locations around it. But in certain locations, especially locations that are more distant, there's that criticism that, hey, they wait too long to refer cases, that they wait until the last minute to refer cases. And so by the time the hospitals get these cases, it is, you know, there's nothing that can be done. But at the same time, the women also criticize the hospitals. The women who go there say that, well, when they go to the hospital, they are prone to dying because the hospitals do not give them the kinds of attention that they want. First of all, the doctors, there's few doctors. The doctors are overworked. The nurses, according to a lot of them, the nurses are rude to them. So they actually say that they get better, more personalized, humane care in these other settings. And I was going to connect this to another question. Now, the categories of the women who went to these faith homes. The women came across, it was mostly middle-class women, because there were women who were university professors, who worked in the civil service, who used these services. There were those women, but there were also the lower-class women who were perhaps just stay-at-home mothers, women who worked in the informal sector, market women. So there was kind of there's a wide range of women, again, depending on the location. In the location in Ede, the Faith Home Training Center itself, it cuts across different social ladder. They say popular women who are respected in the society, have their babies in that particular location, because of course it's more sophisticated, it has more equipment, and they also use fetal monitoring equipment there as well. So women go there, women who are respected, women who are prominent go there to have their babies. In the other locations, the subsidiary locations, it depends on the neighborhood where that hospital is sited. So in some cases, and then they tended to get people too who have had issues with previous pregnancies. So people who had whether they were rich, popular or not, people who had experienced deaths, continued deaths in their pregnancy, infant deaths in their previous pregnancies, or who have had cesarean section or some other type of challenge, and they felt like the hospital could not handle that. Then those women, irrespective of class, tended to turn to the faith homes because of what the faith home offered, the spiritual element of the care that the faith home offered, as well as the practical monitoring that they did. So that would be my comment when it comes to describing the categories of people seeking care. I don't know if I have any other outstanding questions.
And I can send them to you again. I grabbed them and can send them to you. So we will make sure that you can incorporate those into your research process as you wish to.
Yes, yes. And I think Macarena asked a question about where the criticisms were coming from. The criticism was mostly coming from the hospitals, the doctors. So part of it was that the faith homes were taking over the job of the hospitals, especially when it came to Ede, where the faith home had established for itself, even in a predominantly Muslim community, a reputation that Muslim women preferred, a lot of Muslim women preferred to give birth in a faith home, in a Christian, an obviously Christian institution. And so the hospitals would mount some of their criticism, mostly not criticism, but say, hey, you are taking over our jobs, send our patients back to us. There was that angle. And then sometimes the Ministry of Health as well would send In fact, it wasn't necessarily the agents of the Ministry of Health, but people who also claimed to work on behalf of the Ministry of Health will show up accusing them of operating illegally, and so would demand money. So there is that. But a lot of the criticism was coming from their biomedical peers, not necessarily the communities. In many cases, from what I've seen, the community actually welcomed that service, the availability of that service, and the access that they had to that service.
Mary, are you still there? Yes.
I am. Okay, I have to, I'm going to step off, but I'll let Macrina and Drew close it out. Thank you so very much. I actually am hard pressed to think of a Zoom presentation that I have been at in the last year that had such on point and engaged questions. And that's a testament to the compelling research that you've offered, and also that it's just an interesting and cool project to listen to. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary.
We'll bring you
it.
in the future, I hope. And I thank everyone else for their questions.
Yeah, thank you all so much. I'll let Drew close this out.
Thanks everybody for coming. Thank you, Dr. Williams. It was really great to hear your presentation. Certainly a topic that I had not heard much about, and I'm very happy to now know more about. So any closing thoughts from anybody before we end? Okay. All right. Have a good one, everybody. Thanks for joining.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
It was wonderful, and thanks for your wonderful presentation. Keep up the good research. It's awesome.
Thank you. You said that there were similar practices where you in Zambia. Did you say Zambia?
No, in Kenya. I come from Kenya.
Okay.
We have a lot of this kind of faith, faith healing and those kind of things, especially in, what is the name of the church that does this especially? I think it's the Redeemed Churches or something like that, but there's very similar practice from what you're presenting and what I see in my home country of Kenya. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
All right, and a shout out to some of my Nigerian peers who took the time to join us from Nigeria. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.